The docking bay of the Unchained Star stretched wide enough to swallow a small city, and every inch of it hummed with the movement of alien soldiers who had fought wars across 100 star systems. Fleet Captain Torvon Keth stood at the center of the inspection line, with his forearms folded behind his back, and his black compound eyes scanning the row of new transfers, with the kind of cold precision that had earned him command of the 4th Expeditionary Fleet, before he turned 40 cycles old. He was Vexari, which meant he stood over 8 feet tall, and wore his species' natural armor like a second skin, thick plates of dark chitin covering his chest, shoulders, and forearms that could stop a plasma round at close range. Behind him, a dozen officers from a dozen different species watched in respectful silence as their captain moved down the line. The new transfers were a decent batch, Torvon thought. A pair of Drelith heavy gunners, each one a walking boulder of stone-colored muscle and dense bone, stood at attention with the quiet confidence of creatures who had never once in their evolutionary history needed to run from anything. 3 Karathi engineers, tall and thin and silver-skinned, clutched their toolkits and tried not to look nervous. A Siluri combat medic, her 6 eyes blinking in careful sequence as she tracked every movement in the bay. Torvon gave each of them a brief nod of acknowledgement as he passed, and then he reached the end of the line and stopped. The creature standing there was small. That was the first thing Torvon noticed, and for a long moment it was the only thing he could process, because in a galaxy full of species that had evolved claws and venom and natural body armor and electromagnetic senses, this thing had none of it. It stood about 5.5 feet tall, which put it roughly at the height of Torvon's chest. It had soft skin, with no plating, no scales, protective membrane of any kind. Its eyes were small and forward-facing, set in a flat face that carried an expression Torvon's translator flagged as a smile, though the cultural database warned that human smiles could mean several dozen different things, and were not always friendly. It wore a standard Union military uniform that hung slightly loose on its lean frame, and it carried a single duffel bag over one shoulder. "Sergeant Elias Voss," the creature said in a calm, quiet voice that the translator rendered perfectly into Vexari Common. "Reporting for duty, sir." Torvon stared down at him for a long 5 seconds. "You are the human," he said. "Yes, sir." "The integration liaison." "Yes, sir." Torvon turned to his first officer, a scarred Drelith named Commander Rorgan, and did not bother to lower his voice. "This is what the Union sends me," he said, "a species that has been in space for less than a standard century. Possesses no natural weapons, no armor, no venom, no heightened senses of any tactical value, and that evolved, if the records are to be believed, by running away from its own predators on a midweight death world that they somehow failed to tame for most of their history." A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the officers behind him. Elias Voss did not smiling. Torvon leaned down until his compound eyes were level with the human's face, close enough that Elias could see his own reflection, fractured into 1,000 tiny copies across those dark, glossy surfaces. "Tell me, Sergeant," Torvon said, "what exactly do you bring to my fleet?" Elias considered the question with the same unhurried calm he had shown since stepping off the shuttle. "Patience, sir," he said, "mostly patience." More laughter, though this time Torvon did not join it. He straightened up and made a dismissive gesture with his lower left arm. "Cargo. Deck 14, he said. "Report to Shift Leader Dren. Try not to get stepped on." "Understood, sir," Elias said, and he picked up his duffel bag and turned to follow the escort officer who had been assigned to walk him to his quarters. He made it exactly 11 steps before the sound stopped him. It was not a loud sound, not exactly, but it carried a weight that made every creature in the docking bay pause and turn their heads. It came from the cargo shuttle behind Elias, from a large reinforced crate that 3 Karathi dock workers had just finished unloading onto a hover platform. The crate was shaking. Something inside it was breathing, and each breath made the heavy composite walls flex outward in a slow, rhythmic pulse that suggested whatever was in there was very much alive and very, very large. One of the Karathi workers stumbled backward and reached for his sidearm. "Easy," Elias said, and he walked back toward the crate with no urgency at all, as if he were approaching a piece of furniture rather than a container that was now producing a low, rumbling sound that Torvan could feel in the plates of his chest. Elias placed his bare hand flat against the side of the crate and spoke in a language the translator did not recognize, something older than words, something that was more vibration than speech. The rumbling softened. "We are home, big guy," Elias murmured. "Just hold on." He entered a code on the crate's locking panel, and the front wall hissed open and folded down into a ramp. For a moment there was only darkness inside, and the sound of something heavy shifting its weight. Then it stepped out. The creature that walked down the ramp and into the light of the Unchained Stars docking bay was a thing that most of the aliens present had no framework to understand. It stood nearly 4 feet tall at the shoulder, and was over 7 feet long from nose to tail, weighed, as the ship's sensors would later confirm, 914 pounds. Its body was a mountain of dense brown fur stretched over slabs of muscle that rippled with each step, and its paws were wider than dinner plates, tipped with claws that curved like dark hooks, each one longer than a Vexari combat dagger. Its head was enormous and broad, with small dark eyes that held a calm, ancient intelligence. And when it yawned, which it did, slowly, as if the entire docking bay bored it, it revealed a set of teeth that could crush bone like dry wood. Every single alien in the bay went silent. 3 soldiers drew their weapons. Commander Rorgan took a full step back, and he was a Dralith who had once punched a hole through a blast door. The creature, the bear, walked down the ramp and stopped beside Elias Voss, and it sat down on its haunches with a heavy thud that echoed through the bay, and it looked up at the human with an expression that could only be described as patient expectation. Elias scratched it behind one ear. "This is Kodiak," he said to no one in particular, and to everyone at once. No one moved. Captain Torvan Keth, decorated war hero, commander of 12,000 soldiers, conqueror of the Siluri Reach, and the hero of the Korathi siege, stood perfectly still and said absolutely nothing. Kodiak turned his massive head and looked directly at Torvan. The bear's nostrils flared once. Then he let out a sound, not a roar, not yet, but a low, rolling growl that started somewhere deep in his chest and moved through the air like a slow wave of thunder, and every translator in the bay failed to process it, because it was not language and it was not communication. It was a warning. It was the sound of something that sat at the top of a food chain on a world where nothing was safe, and it carried in it a simple, ancient message that did not need translation. "Here, and I am watching, and you would do well to remember it." Elias patted the bear's shoulder. "He is friendly," he said, still smiling that strange human smile. "Mostly." Captain Torvan looked at the human, and then at the creature beside him, and for the first time since he had taken command of the Unchained Star, he found that he had nothing to say at all. In the 3 weeks that followed his arrival on the Unchained Star, Sergeant Elias Voss did exactly what he was told. He reported to Deck 14. He introduced himself to Shift Leader Dren, a squat, 4-armed Prillik who smelled like engine grease and spoke in grunts, and he got to work hauling cargo containers, scrubbing plasma vents, and doing every miserable, thankless task that the shift rotation threw at him. He never complained. He never asked for reassignment. He never once brought up the fact that his actual rank and training qualified him for combat operations and tactical planning, rather than mopping floors and stacking crates. And this quiet obedience seemed to confuse the aliens around him even more than the bear did. Because the bear was always there. Kodiak followed Elias through every corridor, every cargo hold, every mess hall and maintenance shaft on Deck 14, like a vast brown shadow that breathed. Crates, Kodiak walked beside him. When Elias sat down to eat his rations in the crew mess, Kodiak lay on the floor next to him and accepted whatever food Elias offered with a gentleness that looked almost impossible for a creature his size. When Elias slept, Kodiak slept outside his quarters door, and no one, not once, not ever, tried to step over the bear to knock. The crew gave them a wide berth at first. Aliens who had faced plasma fire and orbital bombardment without flinching would press themselves flat against the corridor walls when Kodiak came padding around a corner, his claws clicking on the metal floor with a slow, heavy rhythm that sounded like a countdown to something terrible. But Elias was patient, and patience, as he had told the captain, was what he brought. He learned names, every single one of them. He learned that shift leader Dren had a daughter back on the Prilik homeworld who had just started her first cycle of military training, and he asked about her every morning until Dren started volunteering updates without being asked. He learned that the Karathi engineers on Deck 14 played a card game called Vos Trell during their breaks, and he sat down one day and asked them to teach him, and he lost badly and laughed about it, and they taught him again the next day, and he lost a little less badly, and by the end of the second week he was winning often enough that they accused him of cheating, which he took as a compliment. He fixed things, not the things he was assigned to fix, but the other things, the small, chronic problems that everyone had learned to live with because no one had time or motivation to solve them. The atmospheric recycler on Deck 14 that ran 3 degrees too warm. The cargo lift in Bay 7 that stuck at the halfway point every 4th cycle. The mess hall food dispenser that gave everyone the wrong portions because its species recognition sensor had been miscalibrated for months. Elias fixed all of them, quietly, usually during his off hours, and he never reported the repairs or asked for credit. The crew noticed. They always noticed. And slowly, carefully, the distance between Elias and the rest of Deck 14 began to shrink. The first alien to voluntarily approach Kodiak was Junior Navigator Sitha Vel, a young Drelith female who had been assigned to the lower decks for additional cross-training. Sitha was not like most Drelith, where her species tended to be blunt and physical and uninterested in things they could not punch. Sitha was curious about everything, and her curiosity eventually overpowered her survival instincts. She found Elias in the cargo bay one evening, sitting on an overturned crate while Kodiak lay sprawled on the floor beside him, and she stood at what she judged to be a safe distance and asked the question that had been eating at her for days. "Your species," she said carefully. "You did not engineer this creature." Elias looked up at her and shook his head. "No," he said, "he was already like this when we found him, more or less. You found a creature this size, this dangerous, living wild on your world, and your response was to make it your companion. That is a pretty good summary, yes." Sitha's stone-colored face shifted in what Elias had learned to recognize as deep discomfort. "On Drelith Prime," she said, "our ancestors killed every apex predator within 3 generations of developing tools. It was considered the first mark of civilized species, the removal of existential threats." Elias scratched Kodiak behind the ears, and the bear made a sound like a diesel engine idling in contentment. "We thought about it," Elias said. "We tried it a few times actually, killed off quite a few species. But somewhere along the way, we figured out that some of the scary ones were more useful alive than dead. Wolves became dogs. Wild cats became house cats. Horses carried us across continents. Hawks hunted for us. And bears, Well, bears we mostly just learned to respect. Some of us went further than respect. Further how? We learned to understand them. We learned their body language, and their moods and their boundaries. And in return, some of them learned ours. Kodiak was orphaned as a cub, raised by a wildlife rehabilitation program. He bonded with me when he was 4 months old. He is 11 years old now, and he has been with me through 2 wars and a deep space deployment. And he has saved my life more times than I can count. Scytha stared at the bear for a long time. He could kill you, she said softly. At any moment, without effort, he could kill you. Yes, Elias agreed. He could. And that does not frighten you? Elias smiled that strange human smile, the one that the translator still could not fully. It is not about fear, he said. It is about trust. Scytha did not fully understand, but she filed the conversation away in a part of her mind reserved for things that might become important later. 2 days after that conversation, the incident happened. A standard cargo loading operation on Bay 7 went wrong when the magnetic clamps on a 4-ton equipment pod failed, and the pod slid off its platform and crashed onto its side, pinning a Karathi engineer named Telvos beneath it. The sound of Telvos screaming cut through the bay like a blade, and within seconds a crowd had gathered, but no one could move the pod. It was too heavy for even the Drelith crew members to lift without mechanical assistance, and the nearest cargo exoskeleton was 2 decks away. Elias arrived at a run, with Kodiak thundering behind him, and he took one look at the situation and dropped to his knees beside Telvos. "Hold still," he told the Karathi. "We are going to get you out." Then he looked at Kodiak, and he made a single gesture with his right hand. A flat palm pushed forward and then up, and he said one word in that old language that no translator could touch. Kodiak moved. The bear lowered his massive head and pressed his shoulder against the fallen pod, and he planted his back legs wide, and he pushed. 900 pounds of muscle and bone and raw terrestrial fury drove against the pod, and the metal groaned and shifted, and Kodiak growled, not in anger, but in effort, a deep grinding sound that resonated through the deck plating. And the pod slid sideways, just enough for Elias to grab Telvos by the arms and drag him free. The whole thing took less than 20 seconds. The medical team arrived 4 minutes later and rushed Telvos to the infirmary, where he would make a full recovery. And by the time the cargo exoskeleton finally showed up, there was nothing left to do. The floor of the bay, with his back against a wall, and Kodiak's head resting in his lap, feeding the bear pieces of a protein ration. The crowd that had gathered was still there, still watching, still silent. A Drelith heavy gunner, who had served on the Unchained Star for 6 years and had never spoken to Elias before, walked up to him and said, "That creature just saved a man's life." Elias looked up and shrugged. "He is helpful," he said. The heavy gunner stared at him, then at the bear, then back at him. "I would like to buy you both a drink," the Drelith said. "He does not drink," Elias said, nodding at Kodiak, "but he does accept belly rubs if you are feeling brave." The Drelith considered this for a moment, then slowly knelt down and extended one massive stone-skinned hand toward the bear. Kodiak sniffed it once, then closed his eyes and rolled slightly onto his side. Word spread through the lower decks that night, quietly. Way important things always spread, not through official channels, but through whispered conversations in mess halls and murmured exchanges during shift changes. The human's beast had saved someone's life, and the human had not asked for anything in return. And together, they were something that no one on the Unchained Star had ever seen before. Something that did not have a name in any alien language. Something that humans simply called a bond. The distress signal from Calix Station arrived at 0300 hours, and by 0315 the entire Unchained Star was awake and moving. Calyx was a Union mining outpost on the edge of the Volanther corridor, home to 400 civilian workers and their families, and it had gone dark 6 hours ago after transmitting a single fragmented message that contained 2 words no fleet captain ever wanted to hear. Vreth infestation. The Vreth were the galaxy's nightmare-given flesh, a parasitic hive species that moved through space in massive organic ships and overwhelmed stations and colonies with waves of eyeless, acid-blooded drones controlled by a single hive mind intelligence. Standard protocol for a Vreth infestation was simple: bombard the station from orbit until nothing was left alive inside it. But 400 civilians changed the math, and Captain Torvan Keth was not the kind of officer who wrote off 400 lives. Alternative was difficult. He ordered a boarding action. The assault briefing took place in the main tactical center, and every combat-rated officer and soldier on the ship attended, filling the tiered amphitheater with a sea of armored bodies from a dozen different worlds. Torvan stood at the center and laid out the plan with the cold efficiency that had made him a legend. 3 assault teams would breach the station at 3 points, fight inward toward the civilian habitat ring, and extract the hostages, while a 4th team held the docking corridor. Elias Voss stood at the back of the amphitheater and listened, and when the briefing ended, he made his way down to the front and requested assignment to one of the assault teams. Torvan barely glanced at him. "This is a combat operation, Sergeant, not a cargo run." "I am combat-rated, sir. My file is clear on that." "Your file is irrelevant. You have no experience fighting Vreth." "No one in this fleet has experience fighting Vreth at close quarters on a station this size, sir. We are all learning today." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut, and Torvan's compound eyes narrowed in a way that every officer in the room recognized as dangerous. But Elias did not look away, and he did not stop smiling that calm, infuriating smile. "Union Military Code, Section 41, Paragraph 9, Elias said quietly. "A ranked combat soldier cannot be denied a combat role without documented cause and review. I am requesting my right to serve, sir." Torvan's jaw tightened beneath his chitin plating. "Rearguard Team 9, he said. "Corridor Gamma 6, you will hold the secondary access point after the main teams have passed through. You will see no action. You will guard an empty hallway. Take your animal with you." "Understood, sir," Elias said, and he turned and walked out of the amphitheater with every alien eye in the room following him. 4 hours later, Rearguard Team 9 stood in Corridor Gamma 6 of Calyx Station and listened to the sound of the war going wrong. The assault had started well. The 3 main teams had breached clean and pushed inward fast, clearing corridor after corridor of Vreth drones with disciplined plasma fire and heavy weapon support. Then the bulkheads had slammed shut. Every single interior blast door on the station locked simultaneously, cutting the assault teams into isolated fragments scattered through the station's maze of corridors and compartments. The communications jamming hit a second later, drowning every frequency in a wall of static that turned coordination into guesswork. The Vreth had been waiting. They had let the boarding teams push deep, and then they had sprung the trap, and now thousands of drones were pouring out of ventilation shafts and maintenance tunnels and flooding the corridors from every direction. 9 heard the screaming through the walls before they saw the enemy. The team consisted of 8 soldiers, 4 Karathi, 2 Siluri, 1 Drelith, and Elias, and their commanding officer was a Karathi lieutenant named Vess, who had exactly 0 combat deployments on his record, and had been given the rearguard assignment for exactly that reason. When the first Vreth drone came shrieking out of the ceiling vent 10 meters ahead of their position, Lieutenant Vess froze. The drone was everything the briefing files had described, and worse. A thing of dark chitin and too many limbs, eyeless and screaming, its body coated in a thin film of acid that hissed and smoked where it touched the metal floor. 2 more came behind it, then 10. Then the corridor ahead was a solid wall of them, and they were coming fast. Lieutenant Vess opened his mouth, and no sound came out. Elias stepped forward. "Team 9, listen to me," he said, and his voice was not loud, but it carried a weight that cut through the panic like a sharp edge through cloth. "Fall back to the junction point. Form a firing line across the corridor, 3 meters between each soldier, staggered positions. Do not fire until I say." The soldiers looked at him, this small, soft, unarmored human, and for a half-second, nobody moved. Then Kodiak stepped up beside Elias, and the bear lowered his head and looked down the corridor at the approaching wave of Vreth, and he growled. It was not the warning growl from the docking bay. This was something else entirely, a sound that came from a place older than language, older than thought, a vibration that resonated in the bones and the blood and the deep animal brain that every species in the galaxy still carried, buried beneath their civilized minds. It was the sound of a predator that had decided to fight. The soldiers moved. They fell back to the junction exactly as Elias had ordered, formed their line, and when Elias shouted the command to fire, they fired, and the corridor lit up with plasma bolts that tore into the Vreth wave and turned the front ranks into smoking fragments. But the Vreth kept coming, climbing over their own dead, and the line would not hold for long. Elias gave Kodiak a command, a single guttural syllable that the translator did not even attempt to process, and the bear charged. 900 pounds of Earth's most efficient predator hit the Vreth line like a battering ram made of muscle and fury. Kodiak did not fight the way the aliens fought. He did not dodge or parry or use tactics. He simply destroyed. His claws, each one 5 inches long and curved like steel hooks, tore through Vreth chitin as if it were wet paper, and his jaws closed on drones and crushed them, and threw the pieces aside. And when the acid blood hit his fur, he snarled and kept going, because a grizzly bear had been built by millions of years of evolution to absorb punishment that would kill any other creature on Earth, and keep fighting until there was nothing left to fight. Elias fought beside him, not behind him, never behind him, but right there at his flank, with a plasma rifle in one hand and a combat blade in the other, moving with a fluid, relentless efficiency that the alien soldiers had never seen from any species. He did not waste a single movement. Every shot found a target. Every step took him where he needed to be, and when a Vreth drone got past Kodiak's reach and lunged for Elias's throat, the humans sidestepped it and put the blade to its central nerve cluster with a precision that spoke of training so deep it had become reflex. They held the corridor. They held it for 12 minutes, which felt like 12 hours, and when the last Vreth drone in the immediate wave fell twitching to the floor, Elias did not pause to rest. He rallied Team 9 and 2 other stranded units that had fought their way to the junction from adjacent corridors, and he took command, not because anyone gave him authority, but because he was the only one still thinking clearly, and he led them forward through the station toward the civilian habitat ring. They found the hostages behind a barricade of overturned furniture and welded shut doors. 400 terrified civilians who had spent the last 10 hours listening to the Vreth tear their station apart around them. Elias got them out. When the main assault teams finally breached through the sealed bulkheads and reached the habitat ring, they found the corridor leading to the civilian shelter cleared of Vreth and painted from floor to ceiling in acid blood and broken chitin. At the end of the corridor, sitting on an overturned cargo crate with 3 minor wounds seeping through his uniform, Elias Voss was feeding a protein bar to his bear. Kodiak ate it in one bite and looked up expectantly for another. Captain Torvan Keth walked through the carnage, his boots sticking to the floor with each step, and he stopped in front of Elias and looked at the human, and then looked down the corridor behind him at the devastation that stretched back as far as the eye could see. 400 civilians, all alive. Torvan said nothing. He turned and walked away, and the sound of his boots echoing down that ruined corridor was the only sound in the world. The after-action report landed on Captain Torvon's desk 14 hours after the last shuttle returned from Calyx Station, and he read it 3 times before he believed it. The numbers were not complicated, but they were hard to accept. Of the 4 assault teams deployed during the boarding action, Rearguard Team 9, the unit Torvon had assigned to an empty hallway because he wanted the human out of his way, had suffered the lowest casualty rate of any unit in the operation. They had also secured the primary objective. They had also been responsible for the confirmed elimination of more than 200 Vreth drones, a number that exceeded the kill count of all 3 main assault teams combined. And they had done it under the command of a cargo worker with a bear. Torvon closed the report and opened the combat footage instead. He watched it alone in his quarters, with the lights dimmed and the door locked, and he watched it 3 times. Each time he noticed something new that made the cold feeling in his chest grow heavier. The footage showed the moment the Vreth breached the corridor, the wall of eyeless, screaming bodies pouring from the ceiling vents, and it showed Lieutenant Vess freezing in place with his mouth hanging open, and it showed every other soldier in the unit taking a half-step backward as their training collided with their terror. And then it showed Elias Voss stepping forward. The human did not hesitate, not even for a fraction of a second, and Torvon rewound that moment 4 times to be certain, because he had commanded soldiers from 40 different species across 2 decades of warfare, and he had never seen anyone move toward a Vreth swarm without at least a flicker of fear crossing their face. There was no fear on the human's face. There was nothing on the human's face except a terrible, focused calm that Torvon recognized from the mirror on his own worst days. Expression of someone who had already accepted what was about to happen and had decided to do it anyway. And the bear. Torvon watched the bear charge, and he watched the slaughter that followed, and he paused the footage on a frame that showed Kodiak mid-stride with his jaws open and his claws extended, and 3 Vreth drones coming apart in front of him like they were made of nothing at all. He stared at that frame for a long time. Then he called Elias to his office. The human arrived 12 minutes later, freshly cleaned, but still carrying himself with the slight stiffness of someone whose wounds had not fully healed. Kodiak waited in the corridor outside, and Torvon could hear the bear breathing through the closed door, a slow, heavy rhythm that sounded like something very large, pretending to sleep. "You were assigned to rearguard," Torvon said, without preamble. "Yes, sir." The rearguard was not supposed to see combat. "Did not consult the mission plan, sir." Torvon's jaw tightened. "You assumed command of soldiers who outranked you, from 3 different species, in the middle of a combat situation, with no communication and no authorization." "They needed someone to follow," Elias said. "I was there." A long silence settled between them, and Torvon let it stretch because he was trying to find the words for a question he was not sure he wanted the answer to. "What is that creature to you?" he said finally. "Is it a weapon? Is it a tool? Is it something your species built for war?" Elias was quiet for a moment, and when he answered his voice was softer than Torvon had heard it before. "He is my friend," Elias said. Torvon blinked all 4 sets of eyelids at once, which was the Vexari equivalent of complete bewilderment. "Your friend?" "Yes, sir. A 900-pound carnivore that just tore apart 200 alien parasites with its bare hands." "Is your friend?" "He does not have hands, sir. He has paws. And yes, he is my friend. He has been my friend since he was small enough to fit in my lap. And he will be my friend until one of us dies. And that is not a thing I can explain in a way that will make sense to you right now. But I promise you, it is the truth." Torvon dismissed him, and Elias left, and the bear's breathing faded down the corridor with him. That evening, in the officers' mess on Deck 3, Junior Navigator Scythe Vell stood in front of a wall screen, and gave an informal briefing that no one had asked for, and everyone attended. She had spent the last 2 days doing something that no one else on the ship had thought to do. She had researched Earth. Not the diplomatic files, or the military assessments, or the Union integration reports, but the actual history of the planet itself. The full evolutionary and cultural record of the species that had produced Elias Voss and Kodiak. Found had shaken her badly, and it showed in her voice as she spoke. "The bear is not unique," she said. "It is not a special case or an anomaly. The humans did this with everything." She put an image on the screen, a creature called a wolf, lean and sharp-toothed and golden-eyed, and next to it a creature called a dog, the same species reshaped by human hands over 15,000 years into 100 different forms. They took wolves, pack hunters, apex predators, one of the most dangerous species on their world, and they turned them into companions. They bred them into guardians and herders and hunters and trackers. They made them small enough to hold and large enough to ride, and they did it so thoroughly that the dogs forgot they had ever been wolves at all. She changed the image. Horses, massive and powerful, carrying armored humans into battle. They took prey animals and turned them into war machines. They rode these creatures across continents and into enemy lines, and the animals went willingly because the humans had earned their trust. Another image, a falcon perched on a human's gloved fist, its eyes sharp and wild and utterly focused. They made alliances with birds of prey, animals that could fly, that could simply leave at any moment and never return, chose to come back to the human's hand. Another, a human diver swimming beside a dolphin in dark water. They even befriended creatures in their oceans, species that had no reason to cooperate with a land-based primate, formed working partnerships with them that lasted generations. Sitha paused and looked at her audience. 24 officers from 8 different species, all of them silent, all of them watching her with expressions that ranged from fascination to unease. "Understand what I am telling you," she said. "Every civilization in this galaxy followed the same path when it came to apex predators. Them, you fear them. You kill them. That is the pattern. That is what every intelligent species in recorded history has done. Every single one." She took a breath. "Except the humans." The humans looked at the most dangerous creatures on their world, and they said, "I want that one on my side." A Siluri officer in the second row raised a hand. "The ones that refused," he said, "the predators that would not cooperate with them, what happened to those?" Scytha brought up one final image, a long scrolling list of species names marked with dates and a single word next to each one. "Extinct." "They are gone," she said quietly. The room was very still. Commander Rorgan, who had been standing at the back with his stone arms crossed, spoke into the silence. "So the human on deck 14, he said slowly, the one we assigned to scrub plasma vents and haul cargo, is a representative of a species that spent its entire evolutionary history either befriending apex predators or erasing them from existence." Scytha nodded. "And he brought one with him," Rorgan continued. "A living apex predator from a death world, bonded to him by choice, that follows him through an alien warship and fights beside him in combat, without hesitation. Yes." Rorgan unfolded his arms and looked at the officers around him. "Has anyone informed the captain of this?" "I believe the captain is beginning to figure it out on his own," Scytha said. 3 decks below, in the crew quarters of Deck 14, word had already spread about the briefing, and a small crowd had gathered in the common area, where Elias Voss was sitting on the floor, with his back against the wall, and Kodiak's enormous head resting on his thigh. They came one at a time at first, curious, nervous, drawn by something they could not name. And Elias welcomed each of them with the same quiet warmth. He introduced them to Kodiak, the way a host. might introduce guests to a family member, with care and attention, and an unspoken promise that no harm would come to anyone in this room. The bear was gentle with those Elias trusted, nuzzling their hands and accepting scratches behind his ears with a rumbling contentment that vibrated through the floor. But when a prolific crewman who had been drinking too much stumbled in too loud and too fast, Kodiak's head came up, and his eyes locked on the newcomer, and his body went very still, and the entire room felt the temperature drop by 10 degrees. Elias placed his hand on the bear's neck. "Easy," he murmured, and the bear relaxed. But his eyes did not leave the prolific until the crewman backed slowly out of the room. The message was clear without being spoken. The bear read Elias the way Elias read the bear, and if Elias was calm, then the world was safe, and if Elias was not calm, then God help whatever had made him that way. Late that night, long after the house had returned to quiet, and the guests departed, Elias sat alone and thought about the bear and the thin line between calm and danger. Crew had returned to their bunks, and the common area had gone quiet. The ship's long-range sensors picked up something that made the night watch officer spill his drink. A Vreth hive fleet, 40 ships strong, incoming on a direct intercept course with the Valenthir corridor. The 4th Expeditionary Fleet had 12 ships. The war was not over. It had not even started. Captain Torvin Keth stood on the bridge of the Unchained Star and stared at the tactical display. And what the display showed him was death. 40 Vreth hive ships, each one a living mountain of dark chitin and organic weaponry, were pushing through the Valanthir corridor in a formation that looked less like a fleet and more like a swarm of something vast and hungry moving through the void. His fleet had 12 ships. The math was simple, and the math was brutal, and every officer on the bridge knew it, and nobody said a word, because there was nothing to say that the numbers had not already said for them. Torvin's first officer, Commander Rorgan, broke the silence with the obvious recommendation. "Fighting retreat, sir. We buy time for the civilian transports to evacuate the corridor. Then we fall back to the Karathi line and regroup with the Second Fleet." It was the right call, the rational call, the call that every military textbook in the Union would have endorsed. Torvon was about to give the order when his communications officer announced that Sergeant Voss was requesting a private audience. "Now is not the time," Torvon said. "He says it concerns an alternative tactical approach to the engagement, sir," the officer replied. Torvon closed his eyes for 2 full seconds, then opened them. "Send him in." Elias Voss walked onto the bridge of the Unchained Star, and every officer turned to look at him, and Kodiak padded in behind him, with his bandaged shoulder and his calm amber eyes, and for once, nobody stepped back. "You have 60 seconds, Torvon said. Elias used 30. "You are planning to retreat," he said. "It is the smart move, but the Vreth will follow. They always follow. You will lose the corridor, you will lose every station and colony in it, and when you regroup with the Second Fleet, the Vreth will have doubled their territory, and they will be stronger than they are right now." "Am aware of the strategic implications, Sergeant." "Then let me offer you a different option," Elias said. "We do not retreat. We stand, and we make them break against us." He pulled up a tactical overlay on the bridge display and outlined a plan that was built on a concept he called the Ambush Predator Doctrine. The Valanthir corridor narrowed at a point called the Sarathi Choke, a stretch of space between 2 dense asteroid fields where the Vreth fleet would be forced to compress their formation and reduce their numerical advantage. Torvon's fleet would position itself at the far end of the choke and act as bait, engaging the Vreth head-on just long enough to draw the full hive fleet into the narrow passage. While the fleet held the line, pre-positioned drone mines hidden in the asteroid fields would activate and seal the Vreth's retreat, and 3 boarding teams would launch from concealed positions and hit the 3 largest hive ships simultaneously. Targeting the neural cores that coordinated the entire fleet. "Kill the brains," Elias said, "and the body dies." Torvald stared at the display for a long time. "You want to board hive ships," he said. "Active, fully operational hive ships crawling with tens of thousands of drones. You want to send soldiers inside those things." "I want to send volunteers," Elias said. "Soldiers who understand what they are walking into and choose to go anyway." "And who would lead these boarding teams?" "I would lead the primary assault on the command hive. I need soldiers who are not just brave, but angry. Fear makes people defensive, but anger makes people move forward. I can work with forward." "And the bear?" Elias looked down at Kodiak, who looked back up at him with those ancient, patient eyes. "Kodiak has been angry since the day he was born, sir. It is part of his charm." Torvald turned away from the display and faced the human directly, and for a long moment the two of them stood there. The 8-foot armored insectoid war captain, and the 5.5-foot soft-skinned human, and something passed between them that neither of them would ever be able to put into words. "I am giving you a field commission," Torvald said. "Brevet lieutenant, effective immediately. You will command a multi-species strike force, designation Fang Company. You will have your pick of volunteers." "Thank you, sir." "Do not thank me, Lieutenant. I am sending you into a living hell. If you die in there, I will not be able to recover your body." Elias smiled. "Then I will try not to die, sir." The Battle of the Valanthir Corridor began 6 hours later, and it began exactly the way Elias had planned, with the fleet as bait. Torvald held the line at the Sarathi choke with everything he had. 12 ships arrayed in a defensive crescent that poured fire into the mouth of the narrow passage. Vreth fleet pushed in. The losses were immediate and terrible. 2 Union ships were destroyed in the first 20 minutes, and a third was crippled and left drifting. And the bridge of the Unchained Star shook with every impact, as Vreth organic projectiles hammered the flagship's shields. Torvald stood at the center of the chaos and commanded with the cold, relentless focus that had made him a legend. And he held the line not because he believed he could win, but because a human had asked him to trust a plan, and for reasons he still did not fully understand, he had said yes. The drone mines activated at the 40-minute mark. The asteroid fields on either side of the choke erupted in a chain of directed explosions that collapsed the passage behind the Vreth fleet, trapping them in the kill zone. And then Fang Company launched. 3 boarding shuttles, each one carrying a team of the most violent, stubborn, and angry soldiers Elias had been able to find. Across all 12 ships, shot from concealment, and slammed into the hulls of the 3 largest hive ships like burning fists. Elias led the primary team into the command hive. The interior of a Vreth hive ship was a nightmare made solid, walls of living tissue that pulsed and breathed, corridors that shifted and closed like the veins of something enormous, and everywhere the drones, thousands of them, pouring from every opening in endless waves of chitin and acid and screaming. Fang Company hit them head-on. Elias moved through the hive ship the way water moves through a canyon, finding the path of least resistance and cutting through it with relentless, focused violence, directing his soldiers with short, clear commands that cut through the chaos like a blade through smoke. And Kodiak was beside him, always beside him, the bear's massive form filling the corridor from wall to wall, as he tore through drones with a savagery that turned the passage behind them into a ruin of broken bodies and acid-scorched metal. They fought for 27 minutes to reach the neural core. 27 minutes of close-quarters combat in a living nightmare. And when they finally broke through the last membrane wall into the core chamber, Elias was bleeding from a dash on his forehead, and Kodiak was limping from a Vreth blade that had punched through the muscle of his left shoulder. The neural core was a vast, pulsing organ suspended in the center of the chamber, a brain the size of a shuttle, connected to the hive ship, and through the hive ship to every drone in the fleet. Elias planted the charges. Kodiak stood guard at the chamber entrance, and when a final wave of drones came shrieking down the corridor toward them, the bear drew himself up to his full height, and he roared. It was not a growl, it was not a warning, it was the full, unrestrained voice of Earth's apex predator, unleashed in a space that had never heard anything like it. A sound that shook the organic walls and reverberated through the hive ship's neural network like a shockwave. And for one frozen second, every Vreth drone in the corridor stopped moving. They did not understand what they were hearing. Their hive mind had no category for it, no response pattern, no instinct to draw on, because nothing in the evolutionary history of the Vreth had ever made a sound like that. In that 1 second of hesitation, Elias detonated the charges. The neural core died in a bloom of white fire, and the effect was instantaneous. Across the Vreth fleet, coordination collapsed. Ships began to drift and collide. Drones turned on each other in a frenzy of confused aggression. On the bridge of the Unchained Star, Torvan watched the hive fleet tear itself apart in real time. "Impossible," he whispered in his own language. It was not impossible. It was human. The battle ended 40 minutes later with the complete destruction of the Vreth hive fleet. And when the final tally was taken, the 4th Expeditionary Fleet had won a victory against 3-to-1 odds that would be studied in military academies across the galaxy for centuries. The ceremony took place 1 week later on the main assembly deck of the Unchained Star, with the full crew of 12,000 assembled in ranks that stretched from wall to wall. Captain Torvan Keth stood at the center and called Lieutenant Elias Voss forward. Elias walked through the ranks with Kodiak at his side. The bear's shoulder was bandaged and he limped slightly, and he did not look diminished in any way. He looked, if anything, more real than everything around him. A creature of weight and warmth and ancient power moving through a world of metal and glass. Torvan faced Elias, and 12,000 soldiers fell silent. "When you came aboard this ship," Torvan said, "I called your species soft. I called you weak. Said you had no place in my fleet." He paused, and the silence was absolute. "I was wrong. You are not soft. You are the species that looked at the most dangerous creatures on your world and said, that one is my friend. You did not conquer your world through strength or speed or armor. You conquered it through loyalty, through trust, through the terrifying and incomprehensible willingness to stand beside something that could kill you and believe that it would not. I have commanded warriors from 40 species across 20 years of war, and I have never seen anything as dangerous as a human who has something to protect." He turned to Kodiak. The bear looked up at him with those amber eyes, old eyes, calm eyes, eyes that had seen the inside of a living nightmare and had not blinked. Torvan did something that no one in the assembly expected. He bowed. Not a nod, not an inclination of the head, but a full, deep bow. The kind that a Vexari warrior gives only to an equal, only to someone who has earned the right to stand beside him in battle. Kodiak huffed once through his nose and leaned his massive head against Elias's hip. Elias scratched him behind the ear. The crew erupted, 12,000 voices from a dozen worlds, roaring and stamping and pounding their fists against their armor in a wall of sound that shook the deck plates and echoed through the corridors, and could be heard, people said later, on every deck of the ship. That night, alone in his quarters with the noise of celebration still echoing through the Unchained Star, Captain Torvan Keth opened his personal log and recorded a single entry. Note to Fleet Command: do not underestimate the humans, do not mock them, do not corner them, and for the love of every god in every system, do not threaten anything they have chosen to love. I have seen what walks beside them. I have heard it growl. I do not wish to hear it. Roar. He closed the log. Somewhere below, in the crew quarters of Deck 14, a human was sleeping peacefully with his hand resting on the neck of a grizzly bear. And the bear was dreaming, and his paws twitched in his sleep the way all bears' paws do when they dream. And the ship sailed on through the stars, carrying with it a truth that the galaxy was only beginning to understand. That humanity had never been alone. That humanity had never wanted to be alone. And that the things that walked beside them, the wolves they had turned into family, the horses they had ridden into battle, the hawks and the dolphins and the bears, were not pets, and not weapons, and not tools. They were proof that the most dangerous thing in the universe was not claws or venom or armor. It was love. Stubborn, ancient, unbreakable love. And the whole galaxy would learn to respect it, one growl at a time.